Welcome to Evidence-Based Practice and Quality Improvement. This is Module 4. We're going to be talking about quite a few things that you learned about in Modules 1 through 3. So by now, I hope you have thought about what evidence-based practice looks like. You should have a better picture, a clearer picture of that. And we're going to add quality improvement to that mix, believe it or not. So, in order to do this, we're going to start out with a couple of our module objectives. And these module objectives are to talk again about identifying and applying evidence-based practice to quality improvement guidelines and models, same kinds of things. We then want to analyze and compare those steps in evidence-based practice and QI processes. We're going to apply QI interventions or tools that align with established aims, priorities, and initiatives of that project. And then we're going to critique a clinical practice guideline that we'll introduce you to that's resulted through evidence-based practice, looking at quality improvement for strength of that evidence. What strengthens that clinical practice guidelines and what makes them so important? To start with, we're going to begin by identifying and applying evidence-based practice to quality improvement guidelines and models. So let's start back with evidence-based practice once again. Now, the very first model that came about in evidence-based practice was actually stemmed from Florence Nightingale and her use of pie charts. And it stemmed from her theories about environment, cleanliness, and how she used pie charts to actually demonstrate that this wasn't just her opinion, that keeping the environment clean and the environment filled with light and clean air and clean linens and so forth. It was based on the evidence she gathered in her pie charts. So she was actually credited as being one of the earliest forms of an evidence-based model. Now, moving forward, we're going to the early 1970s. We're going to talk a little bit about this thing called the Kern Project. Now, the Kern Project is probably one of the earlier attempts, along with, of course, a lot later than Florence Nightingale, and it was to increase the use of research in practice by registered nurses. Now, I know you've gone through, and I think you've created a really neat virtual journey of historical development of research, probably back in your module 1 and 2. And I want you to think back to that, because think about how research evolved and really helped to enhance nursing and to help nursing become recognized as an actual profession versus a job, if you will. That was very important to do that. So this is an attempt to increase all that research that was done by registered nurses. And it was a 5-year project awarded to the Michigan Nurses Association by the Division of Nursing in the 1970s. And what this actually did was to help nurses transition from doing the research and getting those research findings now move toward their actual practice settings. Very, very important. We still have a ton of research that's archived and written and placed in a ton of journals, but how much of that research has actually been translated to the bedside? And by the way, there's a type of research to that, as you will probably have heard before, translational research. So you'll hear a little bit more about that later in our module 5 and 6. But back to the Kern Project. This was a realization that practicing nurses would use research only if it had been widely disseminated and was relevant to practice. So I remember a very famous experiment, and I wish I could remember the actual name of it, but I would tell my students this a lot. There was literally $1 million given to an experiment research to see if milk from cows with hides of tan, black, and white taste different. Can you believe that? Now, what was the application of that? How relevant was that? That was $1 million spent on that. And I can't even tell you what the outcome was. I believe the outcome was the milk tasted the same. It wasn't based on the color of the cow, if you will. It was actually based on the ingredients and how we were feeding our cows and how we were taking care of our cows. But that was really how the amount of money that was given to research, and relevancy really wasn't considered. This was done early in the early 60s, I believe. So relevancy is huge, especially today. So we've talked about the Kern Project and its utilization of research in nursing, how those individual nurses move research into practice. Now, growing from that, in the later 1970s is the Stettler model, and it kind of follows along the same lines. We'll give an example here. The Stettler model talks about a little more sophisticated way of actually applying research findings at the individual practitioner level. And it does so in a very succinct kind of way. It's very prescriptive, if you will. It has 6 phases, and it looks at research preparation, the validation of research, a comparative evaluation, decision-making, translation and application of those research findings, and finally, the evaluation of such. What we have here is critical thinking and decision-making are emphasized in this model. That's a huge progression from the Kern Project. So what they're doing here, for example, Stettler is encouraging that nurses have to be very clear about the purpose, context, and sources of any research evidence. There are specific questions that need to be answered. And what are the issues, who are the stakeholders, and how are those outcomes going to be defined? Very, very purposeful. It then goes on and talks about levels of evidence. Well, you've talked about that earlier. So levels of evidence, where did they come from? Is it lower on that pyramid that you now are aware of, that hierarchy of evidence, or is it up higher? The quality of evidence, what is that? And in one text, it goes from level A to level M. All right, so remember levels of evidence. Then a decision has to be made about whether the evidence is available to actually guide research. In this 4th phase, that challenge is to translate or apply research into the practice setting itself. It could be integrating knowledge into practice, and it could be, say, for example, something about discharge planning for patients with heart failure. Now, we know that's been just a huge, huge issue because of the immediate readmission rates that have gone through the roof lately within our facilities. That's a very big issue that's caused an awful lot of extravagant increases in our healthcare costs because we weren't doing a good job of discharge planning for those patients. We were too busy trying to get them out the door, as an example. In the final phase of the Stettler models, then nurses will evaluate the outcomes to their changes in practice. So any kind of changes they made, for example, to those discharge plans in their particular facility, did it actually decrease readmission of heart failure patients from their initial hospitalization? If it did, we're on the right track. If it didn't, we need to start again, don't we? So that's an example of the Stettler model of evidence-based practice. Then a 3rd model comes along, and again, there are many of these models, okay, but these are the 3 major ones. It's called the Iowa model. And what this does is it looks at the same kinds of things. It's the same way, it looks at a way of infusing research into practice, but it's also now applying improvement of quality of care for these patients. So it comes out of the quality assurance model using research. So here it's seen from an organizational level, not just at an individual nursing level, if you will, or a practitioner level. It's looked at from the eyes of the organization. And what it looks at is how can organizations change practice, and should that practice be changed? So the level of the view goes from the individual practitioner up to the organization itself. Now that we've discussed three major evidence-based practice models, let's look at some quality improvement models. And again, there are several of them, but these are the three major ones that you will probably hear about the most. The first one I'm going to look at, in fact, I've got two combined here, but I'm going to start at the middle here. I'm going to start with Six Sigma. This was developed by Motorola in the 1980s. And it takes its name from a statistical notion of sigma used to measure variations from an average, variation from the mean, very scientific. It looks at meeting patient requirements and eliminating errors or reworking with the goal of reducing process variation. So how, as practitioners, would you approach a patient that was recently diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic, for example? It would focus on tightly controlling variations in care delivery of that patient who is newly diagnosed, say, with type 2 diabetes. So it looks at defining, measuring, analyzing, and improving and controlling all those variations. Where one practitioner may address one certain thing, maybe diet's more important to that practitioner. Another practitioner says, we've got to get control of this blood sugar first. Then we can start looking at how we can do that. So Six Sigma had come out of industry. And another improved quality improvement model that has come out of industry is the Lean model. That's sometimes also known as the Toyota quality model, believe it or not. And this focus is actually looking at the reduction of waste from a production system by designing the most efficient and effective system. In our case, when we move this model into the healthcare arena, how do we eliminate waste at the practitioner level in the delivery care to delivery of waste at the facility level, shall we say? So how we do that is we look at standardization and placing the right person with the right resources to the right delivery of care. Now, we've learned here in this Lean model, and we know why you are attending a program that's helping to educate and train you in the role of an advanced nurse practitioner, whether it be as a family nurse practitioner or as a mental health nurse practitioner. So here is a way that we can take nurses who have a wonderful holistic way of approaching patient care and putting them in a more of a lead provider, more independent role in the delivery of healthcare, and yet save cost in the delivery of that care. So there's one way of looking at Six Sigma objectives as well as Lean objectives. There's just some examples. Now, what your book has done is taken these two models and combined them. And what the overlap is waste reduction, the reduction of non-value of work, non-value added work, which we know we can get lost in, say, for example, the minutiae of paperwork, which is now translated into the minutiae of computer work, and efficiency of time. What are some wasting, if we don't have certain resources that we need to deliver care at the bedside, as an advanced practice nurse, shall we say, you are spending so much time, say, trying to elicit information from your patient. What could we do to improve that system of gathering information? What could we have the patient do when they're waiting to come and be assessed by you? What could we do with that waiting time? Can we have them fill out certain forms that would enhance your ability to get to a diagnosis a little quicker, as an example of that? So when we combine these two quality improvement models, that's what we can come up with. Now, a third, probably one of the biggest model that we have that is in contention is the continuous quality improvement model. And it uses the PDSA, or sometimes called PDCA cycle. It's a continuous improvement model. Plan, do, study, act. And you keep doing that. It's like a wheel that keeps rolling and rolling to enhance the delivery of patient care. This is a very holistic kind of approach used to improve organizational performance but it can certainly be done at the level of the unit level, as well as a clinic level, up to a facility level. It looks to understand and also manage variation in the delivery of healthcare. Its primary drivers are things like patient satisfaction as an important performance measurement. It relies on a lot of teamwork and collaboration among healthcare workers to deliver technically excellent customer patient-centered service. No one can argue with that. And this uses, as do the Six Sigma and Lean models, uses tools and techniques that were derived from statistics, operations research, management, marketing, and psychology. And we're going to get into some of those tools in just a moment. What we look at here is the extent to which unit-level QI projects align with larger organizational quality goals. And that's related to their success and sustainability. So this continuous quality improvement model is a wonderful way, and it certainly incorporates some of the Lean objectives as well as the Six Sigma objectives within their particular models. Again, all of this looks to improve cost, quality, and accountability within our healthcare system. Now, this slide is looking at tools of quality improvement, and you see 7 examples of these. In your book, starting on page 171 of your textbook, it talks about under improvement process step 2, which we'll get to those processes in a minute. It talks about a run chart as an example of one tool. A run chart is a way of graphically displaying data that shows trends in a measurement of interest. It could be trends of something that happens over time. We could look at the value of a measurement, looking at the outcome of interest. Is it hitting a target area that we want it to hit in? For example, measuring blood glucose at a certain time of day on patient A is our effect of when we give a medication such as a certain anti-diabetic medication. Is that effective in controlling blood sugar, or is it not? Run charts could certainly help depict that kind of thing. So that gives an example of how we can chart blood glucose levels, and then we can see the effectiveness of any intervention that we happen to be giving that particular patient. So that's an example of a run chart. On the upper left-hand corner, you see a thing called a depiction of a control chart. That's also used to track a performance over time, but it's a little more sophisticated than that run chart that you see. This includes information on average performance level of a certain system. And it looks at upper and lower limits. And then it also looks at that thing called standard deviation, which you should know what I'm talking about. You should understand those terms. So that's a control chart. That helps us to develop a very specific kind of variation, perhaps in our use of healthcare, our intervention that we're examining. Graphs are something else that we can use to see how well we are doing. A very interesting chart could be a Pareto diagram. This is a special kind of bar chart, if you will. And that's used to understand frequency of factors that contribute to a certain common effect. It's sometimes referred to as the 80-20 rule, or the law of the few, which states that 80% of variation in a problem originates with 20% of cases. You've probably heard of that 80-20 rule before. So that's an example of a Pareto diagram to do that. There's also histograms at the bottom of your slide here that can actually depict certain things about a performance as well, levels of performance. Picture's worth 1,000 words. You can quickly see the majority of people performed at a certain level with a histogram as an example. Then we have cause and effect diagrams. These are other tools that can be used. One example would be that fishbone diagram that you see. This helps us with brainstorming about perhaps causes of a certain problem of a diagnosis. And we can group those causes around categories such as environment, types of patients, materials, resources, processes. They can be used proactively to try to prevent any kind of defect in our systems or errors. It could also be used retrospectively to figure out what contributed to a certain particular defect or error that has already happened or already occurred. These are a way of looking at root cause analyses to identify failures in our system that resulted in pretty severe errors. So that's another kind of example or tool that we use. There are also flow charts that kind of show us how a process actually works, and these can be used to detail certain steps. And here we can look at how it helps us to understand a certain process. It can also help us simplify processes if we feel that we need to eliminate some steps in that particular process. It can also help us to identify who's involved or affected by this process, and it helps us to formulate questions for certain further research if that is required. So here again are examples of tools that we can use for quality improvement. And you may be asked to use a certain tool for a particular problem that you have identified. Now we're moving forward and we're going to analyze and compare steps in both evidence-based practice and quality improvement processes. So what is done here is there is an outline of an evidence-based practice process that was taken out of, I believe it was chapter 1 of your textbook. And then we looked at a process, a QI process. And while the steps are a little bit more numerous on the evidence-based practice side of things, I think you can pull out and extrapolate a lot of common areas. So let's look at the EBP process first. It says to select a topic, which we've asked you to do at the beginning of this course as an example. On the QI process of that can come up with assessment. You're using broad questions, check sheets, data sheets, some of those processes we talked about, surveys, focus groups, and interviews, to figure out where is a problem? Is there a problem? So we look at the process, we form a team under the EBP side. We're certainly going to form teams on the QI side. And we're going to look at evidence retrieval based on that topic of retrieval. Very, very important. And when we get that evidence, we're going to do a critical appraisal of that evidence. Sliding across to the QI process, this is where analysis comes into play. We're determining common cause versus special cause variations through those tools I just described earlier, such as graphs, cause and effect diagrams, and flow charts. That's part of our analysis. Moving back to the EBP process, we're going to synthesize the evidence that we have gleaned that we feel that is appropriate, and we're going to come up with certain recommendations. This can be included in the QI process as developing a plan of improvement. And we do that by looking at 3 guiding questions, those aims, measures, and potential changes that come from our assessment and analysis. Moving back to the EBP process, we want to make a decision to change practice. Is there enough evidence that says, hey, we need to look at this? Let's go back to something we probably are all familiar with at this point. We used to use a certain kind of heparin to keep certain IV extension tubing open, we'd say. We want to make sure that it would, we could still go through and make our IVs accessible. Well, we know that we don't need to use heparin anymore. Saline will do just as good a job. It's a lot more efficient, cost-wise. It's probably safer for our patients, and it does just as well. So here's an example of a decision to make a change in our practice. And that came from looking at the evidence, looking at the research that was done, and a quality improvement process was engaged to make sure that a change of practice was something that we could actually go for. We then implement the change of practice based on the evidence, based on the plan that we have done to make this improvement. Moving back to the EBP process, we evaluate and then disseminate that change. And under the QI processes, we test and implement the improvement plan using the PDSA cycle. We decided, yes, it works. So look at how those two processes can actually merge and support each other. I hope that kind of helped clear that up and make that a good cause for why do we have evidence-based practice and why QI is so important. Now, this slide is looking at how we would apply, for example, a certain quality improvement intervention that aligns with established aims, priorities, and initiatives of a question that we had. So here's a depiction of a QI project that does just that, and it's centered on women who have been diagnosed with an STI. Are they notified of those results within 7 days? That's something that's a qualifier there. Now that's an example of what's running this. I want you to think of your topic of interest that you feel is important for you in your future role as an advanced practice nurse. Now, for an FNP person, you can, anything clinically that you are inclined to, an airfield of practice that you are gravitating toward. For the mental health nurse practitioner, you can do the same thing that would align with a mental health issue, for example, that would be appropriate for an advanced practice nurse to address. Find a quality improvement interventions that outlining a project that may support your topic of concern. So here the aim is the increase of percentage of women with an STI who are notified of their results within 7 days. So here are the key drivers that have pushed this to cause design changes to occur. The key drivers are the ability to contact patients, the systematic approach used for the follow-up, the patient-provider communication, and they've got added here adolescent behavior. I'm not quite sure what that was part of, but I just extracted this from an example. But at least focus on the first three. That would kind of make more sense to us. The design changes that they came up with was to ask for a cell number and then an alternate number, or as a third option, get an email address. That helps cover ability to contact. Then the systematic approach to follow-up is to come up with an algorithm that everyone can use that will help toward increasing the percentage of women with an STI notified of results within 7 days. So the algorithm then would be assigned to a person with follow-up that they can use, alter the time of days that are time of day the calls are made, have dedicated numbers. This is the systematic approach to the follow-up, and then give NPs a cell phone for patients to call. So this is how we're going to start designing the change. To enhance patient-provider communication, we're going to modify the EMR home going info. You had STI testing, and they're going to be given a card with information regarding what happened and what to expect. Very, very important. So I won't go any further with the adolescent behavior, but here's an example of applying quality improvement interventions with what we've established as far as priorities, aims, and initiatives to support this particular problem. So I want you to think about how you can do this, because guess what, ladies and gentlemen, this is what's going to initiate clinical practice guidelines. So now we come to critiquing clinical practice guidelines in evidence-based practice and quality improvement for strength of evidence. This is our final module objective for Module 4. In order to critique, we need to understand first what are clinical practice guidelines. Now, I know you've probably heard this term before, but I'm going to have you revert back to Chapter 8, and I'm looking at page 107. And in your textbook, clinical practice guidelines are defined as systematically developed statements and recommendations intended to optimize care and link research and practice by providing a guide for practitioners. You are the practitioners. These CPGs, that's the shortened version of this, are informed by a systematic review of the evidence and include an assessment of benefits and harms of alternative care options. That came out of the Institute of Medicine in 2011. They are being developed actually globally and used to reduce healthcare service variability and to improve resource use and clinical outcomes. Does that not reek again of quality improvement? It's the same thing. So it's taking all this evidence from research that's converted into evidence-based practice, what is the best, grading the levels of that evidence, and then getting these massive recommendations drilled down to what's the strongest evidence that I can use to support how I can approach dealing with that patient, treating that patient that's just been diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic. All right, so we'll keep on that same track. These guidelines are used by clinicians at the point of care and by administrators to conduct cost-benefit analysis to improve those clinical outcomes so they can reduce cost of care, create satisfying patient-provider experiences. Again, they talk about using the Iowa model so that CPGs function as knowledge-focused triggers coupled with internal quality improvement data from problem-focused triggers to propel clinical teams and QI committees to consider critically appraising new clinical practice guidelines or improving on older ones. An example mentioned in your textbook is QI data on a sample of adult patients at high risk for diabetes. And they go on to describe how a QI team of a large primary care system was considering a policy change regarding allocation of resources for a routine diabetic screening and lifestyle modification program. So there you go. This is how we can use clinical practice guidelines. And I think we've answered what is a clinical practice guideline and how does QI affect or influence CPGs. So again, why do you think it's important to appraise or critique a clinical practice guideline? What's important? Well, your book will then support this question by saying it will enhance the team's position in making a convincing argument to healthcare colleagues and administrators about why or why not to adopt a certain clinical practice guideline as a policy or a practice standard. It's not, a lot of people will say that CPGs are cookbook medicine. That was one of the biggest hurdles or barriers that I came across when we first introduced clinical practice guidelines as a concept in military nursing. As an example, this was done way back in my practice. I am a retired military nurse. And when we introduced clinical practice guidelines to our practitioners, there was an awful lot of kickback, as you can imagine, on this. Don't tell me how to deliver care in my own practice. That's not what the intention is. The intention is to decrease variability of healthcare delivery, ensuring that everyone gets an equal opportunity to be treated appropriately for type 2 diabetes as one such example. So this is based on best available evidence, and it gives clinicians, and you are a clinician or a future clinician, with an algorithm for clinical management or decision-making for specific disease states. These can be pain management, diabetes, it can be obesity, hypertension. Those are some of the top topics that there's been a lot of clinical practice guideline development in. And there's a whole lot more. Where can you find clinical practice resources? Where can you find them? Well, you can find them under the American College of Physicians, American Psychiatric Nurses. You can find them in family nurse practitioner resources, online resources. You can certainly find selected databases for locating these practice guidelines in PubMed, in guideline summaries, in TRIP database, in the Scopus database, in the United States Preventive Task Force database, in the Primary Care Clinical Practice Guidelines database. The Cochrane Library is huge for this and very well known under the International Guideline Network and International Guidelines Library. And these IT resources are all listed on page 109 in Chapter 8 of your textbook. So what we'll do after this is I hope that you'll be able to, with an understanding that you've gained through your reading and through reviewing this video and listening to my presentation along with this video, that you can identify appraisal criteria and critique a clinical practice guideline of your choice using a format I've provided that you will find under the assignments section of this module. Now, I hope that you can respond to each module outcome, there are 4 of them, and nod and go, yes, I now have an understanding of each of those outcomes. If not, if there are any areas that remain unclear after you have done some reading, thinking, and contemplating about what you've read, please feel free to Google. Please look at referred sources only if something isn't clear to you. After you've listened to the delivery that has been provided to you for each slide in the PowerPoint presentation, I hope you'll have a better understanding of evidence-based practice and how it now fits with the quality improvement. It's been a pleasure. Please feel free to notify your professor of any questions that you may have. Thank you.